Degrees.
Did I call it 64? Thank you. Thank you very much.
But you didn't say the year. 1982.
82.
And you remember that because I remember you had to work a double that day.
I did, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that was before them giving you Christmas dinner.
Yeah. I opened the gifts with the kids through email message because we didn't have
carrier pigeon.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, Ed, thank you.
you.
The Oak Forest High School basketball team will be sporting some new gear at their next game thanks to an alum chasing his dreams. The college player who got his start here wanted to give back. Our Jermont Terry was at the school for the big surprise.
I haven't been here since maybe the summer, I think.
As Robbie Avila walks the hall of Oak Forest High, memories come back for this basketball star.
High school, I was about 6'8", so I grew about 2 more inches. I'm at 6'10" now.
While tall in stature, his heart just might be the biggest thing about him.
Here's my All-State plaque. I was All-State 2021, 2022.
Today, he plays college ball for Indiana State University. After 2 years on the college court, Robbie's using the money athletes are making in their name, image, and likeness and giving back.
Allowing for us to, make a little bit of money off our name, to, help us out financially while we're in college. It's something definitely, you can't go wrong on. These lockers are a little too small for me.
The 20-year-old opted to do something big for the varsity basketball team.
What are you gifting the players with?
I did, so I got them a pair of the Giannis Immortality, I think the 3.5s.
20 new kicks for every player and coach.
Depending on the size, around $100. So.
Robbie knows this is bigger than basketball and more about leaving.
We have breaking news into the CBS 2 newsroom. A jury has reached a verdict in the Ed Burke trial.
The former alderman facing 14 counts in a federal indictment, and they include, among other things, racketeering, bribery, and attempted extortion.
This is a live look at the, we have some tweets there.
We do. These are tweets from our CBS Chicago crews that are stationed at the Dirksen Federal Building. It says the jury is in court now. They are passing the verdict forms to a judge. The judge is reading over the verdict forms as the courtroom waits in silence. We're refreshing this as our crews update this constantly. Not only are they inside the courtroom, but also outside waiting for reaction as we learn these counts. We now want to take a live look at the Dirksen Federal Building, if we have that shot, where the verdicts will be read.
This was a 6-week trial, 40 witnesses, 150 secret recordings. At the center of this, perhaps the most powerful alderman ever to sit in the Chicago City Council.
Right now, one of Burke's co-defendants, the judge is announcing that the jury finds Charles Cui guilty of counts 12 and 13, also guilty on count 14. You'll have to bear with us. A number of counts for not only Ed Burke, but his 2 co-defendants as well. So we will be going through that as we learn it with you right here from Twitter. We've got a guilty count on count 15 also for his co-defendant. And that's Charles Cui.
Peter Andrews was the other defendant in this case. 3 defendants altogether: Ed Burke, Charles Cui, and Peter Andrews. Essentially, Ed Burke was accused of using his power as a city council finance committee chairman and longtime 14th Ward alderman to lure people to his private tax law business.
So again, we're going through here. We have Charles Cui guilty on count 15, 14. And we're waiting for updates right along with you. Looking for another update. Again, 14 and 15 for Cui. Joe, as we bring in these counts, let's send it over to you. Thank you for joining us here as we await the reading of all of these counts.
Yeah, a couple of observations off the top here, Marie and Jim, is that we don't have a hung jury. There were some who thought that might be an issue here today, but we do know that, in fact, they have reached a verdict, and we're hearing some of those verdicts right now against some of the other defendants. The other thing we should probably set up here for folks who haven't been following this closely is just the difficulty the jury had in these instructions. As we sifted through some 300-plus pages, Here we're getting the first Ed Burke guilty on count one. Count one was one of the biggies. That was racketeering. As I was saying, though, there are charges, counts, and then subsections of these counts that the jurors had to sift through. This was some 300 pages of jury instructions broken down and basically boiled down to maybe 30 or 35 in the end. But in these forms, the jurors had to essentially agree on one of three subsections in order to get to a guilty verdict on count one. So this was extremely complicated. Even legal minds were looking at this, breaking it down, or trying to anyway, and saying this was an incredibly difficult and complicated job for this jury. And as we know now, it's taken 3 days, 2 full days after yesterday, and then half a day today. So this has been a lot of work for this jury. But we do know that Ed Burke has been found guilty on count one. That was racketeering. And again, as we mentioned, part of this count one is attempted bribery, official misconduct, and then use of an interstate facility to aid unlawful activity in violation of Title 18 and then the section. The other thing to keep in mind here essentially is that this is sort of like conspiring to agree to do something unlawful, and there need to be 2 overt acts, these subsections, if you will, in order to get to the guilty on that first count. So the jury has done that with count one. That was the racketeering count. And again, these all go back to charges of Ed Burke using his position as an alderman to try to get something on the back end of this, namely business for his law firm. Ellie, can you repeat that for me, please? Okay. We should probably point out, too, that there are no cameras allowed in federal court, so that's why we are seeing the Twitter feed right now with some of these explanations and some of the guilty verdicts that are coming in. Again, 3 defendants, including Ed Burke. We know there's another guilty on count 17 for Charles Cui. Charles Cui was facing 5 counts as I see it here. So I think it's now guilty on 14, 15, and 17. Let's bring Irv Miller in, our legal analyst. I believe Irv is with us right now. Irv, first of all, I guess as you look at this, and let's get your reaction to guilty on count one first for Ed Burke. Go ahead, Megan.
Okay. So Joe just asked your thoughts on guilty on count one for Ed Burke.
Count one is the big count. That's the 20-year ones, the racketeering count, which means they had to find at least 2 racketeering acts in order to find it guilty of count one. It is the most serious charge.
Are you surprised?
No, I'm not surprised about this one.
What about your thoughts on the other? We have Cui guilty, count 17.
Count 17 is lying to the FBI. I'm not surprised about that one either.
Are there any that you're surprised we're not getting a guilty for, especially on the Burke front?
I don't know what the verdict is on Andrews yet, but I suspect that he could be lying to the FBI, but I don't know if that's...
It looks like Andrews not guilty on all counts.
Okay, then I'm right about that one. So, I'm not surprised they had the weakest case on Andrews.
Which 2?
Joe, any other questions?
You know what, Megan, we're going to ask you to stand by there because we're having some issues with your audio and your microphone, so we want to revisit you and Irv as soon as we get that straightened out. But we do have 2 new verdicts on Ed Burke. Count 2, guilty. Count 3, guilty as well. So Ed Burke found guilty so far on counts 1, 2, and 3. And these are racketeering is count 1, 2 is corruptly soliciting and demanding things of value, and count 3, use of an interstate facility to promote bribery and official misconduct. 2 more verdicts in right now. Guilty, as you can see there, on count 4 and 5. Not guilty, count 6, and guilty on count 7. So not on 6. Count 6 was conspiracy to commit extortion. That involved the Burger King parking lot. And as you know, if you've been following this, there were 4 alleged schemes, including a Burger King parking lot, the old post office, a Binny's sign. And so we do know now that the conspiracy to commit extortion in the Burger King case was found not guilty. But up to that point, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 7 guilty. Now we're hearing 8 and 9 also guilty. So this, at this point, 8 of 9 counts against Burke, he has been found guilty. The one not guilty is count 6. Count 8, use of an interstate facility to promote bribery and official misconduct involving the Burger King. That was a guilty. And then count 9, use of an interstate facility to promote bribery and official misconduct. That also involving the Burger King case. The next 2 counts against Ed Burke, also guilty. Count 11 and count 15. Count 11, corruptly accepting and agreeing to accept things of value. Count 15, use of an interstate facility to promote bribery and official misconduct. Again, guilty on all so far except 1 of the 15 against Ed Burke. Megan, I'm hoping we have the audio figured out with your, okay, we do not just yet. And then the other thing that came out, we did hear a little bit from Megan that the case against Andrews, all not guilty in that. And as far as I know, there's only been one that we've seen from Charles Cui, and that was 17, which is making a false statement to the FBI, and that was also a guilty verdict as well. Let's set it back down to Marie and Jim. At this point, we have several of these verdicts coming in, but just at this point, 1, 2, 3, and then for Ed Burke, and then a few more for Cui. So we'll wait to see where those come in.
Right, thank you, Joe. Our crews here are now getting in position as we work on Megan's audio to bring you some reaction. We're getting a new information
16,
on Ed Burke.
19, 18 is 16, 18, 19. Three more guilty verdicts for Ed Burke. Apparently, the observers in the courthouse and the courtroom say that he showed no emotion. He's been there every day with his wife, the former Chief Justice of the Illinois Supreme Court, Ann Burke.
We know that he's been there. Cui has been in the hospital. Just in the past few days, we understand that he is attending by some sort of video conference or on the phone. So he is not in the room. We haven't heard different, but we assume Andrews is also in the room.
This is an incredible come down for the man who was one of the most powerful city council members in the city's history. Former chair of the finance committee, the all-important, the powerful finance committee. Let's go back to Megan Hickey. She is with our legal analyst,
There isn't like a
Irv Miller.
comprehensive list for.
Megan?
So we are just getting these as you guys are getting them, and it's a little bit of a delay because we're actually downstairs right now while Chris and some of the other folks are still upstairs. But we're catching up. We've got jury finds Ed Burke guilty on count 11 and count 15. Our legal analyst, Irv Miller, wanted to get your thoughts on those ones in particular.
The big one was count 1. That's the 20-year one. These others that are coming in right now are lesser charges. The count 11 carries a 10-year maximum. Count 15 carries a 5-year maximum. But that count 1, 20-year max, that's the one that he was really worried about.
Wow, okay. It looks like from Chris Ty, we're learning that Ed Burke found guilty on all RICO counts attached to all episodes. According to him, he could be sentenced to 20 years for this count alone. If you could explain a little bit what a RICO count is and why that's significant.
That's the count that deals with the individual racketeering acts that he committed. He needed to be found guilty of at least 2 racketeering counts, and what you're saying, he was found guilty on all of them, but he only needed to be found guilty of 2 in order to be guilty of count 1.
And to clarify, guilty on 10 counts, not guilty on 1. This is, I think, pretty stunning to me. I know this is something that you have a lot of background in, though. What are your thoughts on just the number of charges now that we're hearing he is found guilty on?
Well, actually, as I've said, the 1 is the important. Everything else is extra. It could go to enhance any potential sentencing that he may get in the future because he's convicted of all these other things. That's what a judge will consider at sentencing. But as far as guilty and not guilty, he's guilty today. He has to report to a probation department to get what's known as a pre-sentence investigation. So a judge could read that and say, here's what I'm going to sentence him to, up to 20. And because of his age, because he has no criminal background, the judge is going to most consider that he's a public official that was corrupt, and I suspect he's looking at possibly anywhere between 8 and 12 years on count 1 alone.
When you say up to 20 for that first count, is there a minimum? What's the minimum?
There is no minimum, but that's controlled by what's known as federal sentencing guidelines, but those are advisory. Those are not mandatory. A judge could deviate either way on the guidelines. It's the maximum sentence that is the important thing in this case.
They have to stick to. So we're looking at, I mean, just for that one alone, potentially some jail time, but again, there's discretion.
If he survives an appeal, which is always going to come in this particular case, he's looking at jail time, no question about it.
So, we won't see him walk through the lobby today?
They may insist that he goes up to the marshal's office on the 24th floor to get fingerprinted and photographed, or they may set a time for him to do that in the future. Okay. So that would delay it, not that much. It probably takes about 15 minutes to get fingerprinted and photographed up in the marshal's office, if that's the process right now.
Okay, and that's just up to the judge's discretion, or who decides that?
She'll turn to the marshals and say, are you prepared to fingerprint one or more of these guys today?
Wow, amazing to think of the city's longest-serving alderman being fingerprinted. Joe had a couple questions for you.
I'm curious what you make of what the jury had to deal with here. Relatively speaking, how complicated was this? How difficult was it? And in general, I think the one point that we kept hearing from Burke's team anyway is that you have these allegations, but I think as one of his attorneys said, where's the beef? You know, he didn't necessarily get anything for these allegations that were made against him. He was really, did you ever have to pay to get the parking lot fixed? Well, no. Did you ever give him your tax business? Well, no. How do you think all of that washed out in the jury room?
I don't think it made a difference to the jury because they're instructed that he's being charged only with attempted extortion in these cases, the counts that he's been found guilty of so far. And that means the crime is the solicitation, not the actual receipt of any money. It's the mere fact that he tried to get something, some monetary value in exchange for his official acts as an alderman of the city of Chicago.
Irv, I'm interested in your thoughts about the length of this deliberation. I know they got it at around 2:15 on Monday. It's now Thursday. Is this about what you were expecting, and what goes into a deliberation like this one?
Well, I predicted it would be Tuesday, so I'm wrong already. But you had 3 defendants, and you had 4 schemes, basically, in this case. They had to decide each count for each defendant, so it took time. Obviously, they did this carefully because there's a mixed verdict here. This is not all guilties. The government was hoping for 19 guilties in this case, and that's not what happened. So it shows they followed the instructions, they followed what the rules are. It's obviously they worked together as a group and came up with an intelligent answer, in my opinion.
So you feel like this is the sign of a conscientious jury in this case?
I do. I mean, if it was all guilty or all not guilty, I wouldn't say that. But the fact that they were able to distinguish between the individuals in deciding guilt or not guilt means a lot to a lawyer that does this for a living.
How do you think the timing maybe played into this with Christmas holiday coming up, the last business day, I guess, being tomorrow? I would say this is typical of what goes on in these public corruption cases. If you look at all these that have been tried in this building, this is a pretty average right now. If it had gone past Friday and into next year, that would have been something really different than out of the ordinary.
I don't know, Joe, if you had any other questions for our expert on the field right now,
hey,
but we're just...
Megan and Irv, it's Jim. Irv, I wonder if you can walk us through the appeal process and what will happen to the alderman during the appeal process.
So the next step is going to be a motion for new trial. It will be heard in front of Judge Kendall sometime in the future. Those are never granted. I'll tell you right now, they're never granted. The next step after that is to file an appeal with the 7th Circuit Court of Appeals, which sits in this building. They will take time to decide whether or not they're going to issue a decision quickly or sit on it. The most important question is, when you're found guilty, he's not going to be taken into custody today, and he's not going to be taken into custody at the day of sentencing. The question is, will they let him stay out on bond during the pendency of the appeal? But that'll be several months from now.
Yeah. Okay. We actually have Chris Tye with us right now. You are straight out of the room. I mean, where it all happened. So I'll hand it over to you because you saw it all happen.
Yeah, you know, Megan and Irv, it was a very emotionally charged room, as you can imagine. Ann Burke came up to her husband just minutes after the sentence came down, Irv, and gave him a big hug and a kiss. His grandchild was sitting behind them with a number of his kids. As one after the other, these counts, all but one against Ed Burke, coming down guilty. Pete Andrews, of course, I'm sure you guys have been recapping this, so I'm kind of catching you midstream. But inside that courtroom, it was very tight. You had a lot of U.S. attorneys in there. You had a huge presence of the U.S. Marshal's office just to make sure everything is secure. And Irv, I'm assuming that that's not uncommon. I mean, as I just walked down here, or took the elevators down here, and excuse me, I'm a little out of breath. I mean, there's a wall of security guards here. There's a gaggle of media on what is nothing short of a historic day in the city of Chicago. The longest serving alderman, of course, of all time now loses his pension as a result of this, assuming that this verdict holds. And Irv, I can't help but think that this thing began 1 week after Halloween, and here we are 5 days before Christmas and getting this conclusion. Really a tremendous amount of information. Dozens of witnesses, over 100 pieces of evidence, a lot of it very intricate audio, video evidence. This jury taking this amount of time, just 30 some hours. Does that hit you about where you thought it would be?
I actually thought it would be somewhat shorter. I thought it would come back on Tuesday, but obviously they were dissecting these counts. They were dissecting the instructions and trying to do their job as jurors and sitting in judgment of another person. So they took it seriously, and they didn't care that they had to keep coming back to federal court day after day, some of them from very long distances, and they did their job.
And, you know, a lot of people were pointing to Burke's defense team, and obviously there are 3 defendants here, but let's talk about Ed Burke primarily because he is the name that so many Chicagoans for generations have known. He represents what has been considered the machine of Chicago politics. There was so much behind the scenes ahead of this trial. Could the name Donald Trump be invoked in this trial? And the answer was no, because there was a concern that would inflame some of the jurors. There was a pitch that, hey, in just a couple of days he turns 80 years old. His defense team saying, hey, you know what, let this guy go home for Christmas. Let him be home with his family, and indeed he will. He's only going from the 25th floor to the 24th floor right now to be fingerprinted. Then he'll go home. They'll come back in June for a pre-sentencing hearing, and I guess that is pretty par for the course.
Right. Both sides get to file any objections to the pre-sentence investigation, looking for clarifications if there's any mistakes. The judge will ultimately decide what can stay in that pre-sentence investigation, what she'll consider, and then eventually, after all those logistics are done, she'll set a date for sentencing, which the probation department will make a recommendation to her as what the probation officer feels is the right sentence in this case. It's going to be jail time. The question is how many years.
And for a guy who's turning 80 years old on the week of Christmas and New Year's, 20 years on count one alone would be a life sentence.
Well, it would, but you have to understand that is the maximum sentence. That's not what he's going to get. Federal sentencing guidelines come in a lot lower than that. However, the judge has the discretion to do what she wants, irregardless of what is in the federal sentencing guidelines. But I would submit it's going to be anywhere between 8 and 12 years is where I would put it, looking at all the factors in this case.
I want to paint a little bit more of a picture, a more vivid picture of what was going on up in 2501. That's the courtroom of Judge Virginia Kendall. She came in, she indicated that the jury had reached their verdict about 5 minutes to 2 o'clock this afternoon. The jury came out just about 20 minutes after that. Very quickly, this all transpired, and Judge Kendall told all the parties involved, you need to be close by. You need to be within 10 or 15 minutes. And indeed, they assembled very quickly. Now, Charles Cui, one of the defendants, the defendant involved in that Benny's pole sign episode, was not in court today because he has apparently a medical condition. He waived his right to be in the courtroom. He did appear by WebEx. I'm keeping an eye out over here, and apologies to the control room because I need to put my earpiece in here shortly. But we are watching this podium to see who may come to the podium. There's a number of players here that we could hear from. The U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois, of course, he was in court. Mr. Pascal was in court today. He could be talking, likely to be the face and the voice of the U.S. Attorney's office, even though he didn't particularly prosecute this case. Then, of course, there's the attorneys for Ed Burke, who presumably are with their client right now on the 24th floor. And then there's the attorneys for Pete Andrews, who really are coming out of this victorious. No No two ways about that. A real open and close victory for the Andrews team. And then the Charles Cui team also guilty on all counts. We may hear from those attorneys as well. Then there is the question of this jury, and Irv talked about it. These jurors come from sometimes an hour and a half away, Montgomery, Illinois being one of those places. They're coming here every day for the last 6+ weeks, and today they may, we don't know, this is always up to the jury, they may come out and face the press and talk about what resonated with them. And this case has so many layers to it. The judge said to the jury before they were excused, "Thank you for your service. I'm going to come back to that jury room and thank you personally." She said time and time again, this was a group of 12 people, 9 women and 3 men, who worked very harmoniously together. They were always on time. Anytime someone brought up Ed Burke in their orbit, they were always quick to mention it because there was a concern that they could get tainted. She said this jury was above reproach. The real key here is that how this jury interpreted the Danny Solis testimony and the Danny Solis undercover wires is hugely valuable for the U.S. Attorney's Office still, because of course he is not just the star witness in the Ed Burke case, he is also the star witness in the Mike Madigan trial, which, as we know, is slated for April but could be pushed back because of a number of legal maneuverings. I want to just put my earpiece in here just so I can hear the folks back at the station if need be, because perhaps I'm going on too long. But I just want to point out that the key here for this jury is that really a lot of people want to talk to them, not just the defense attorneys for Mike Madigan, to see, hey, you know, what worked? What should we be emphasizing? What should we be downplaying when our case comes up? Also, the prosecution would want to hear from them as well to see how they might want to augment the use of Solis in a federal prosecution. So there are really no two ways about this. There are a number of characters here that we want to kind of hear from today. It's unclear if any of them will talk. It's very understandable if it's a zero across the board. I would expect to hear from the U.S. Attorney because obviously, other than the Pete Andrews charges, it was a pretty clean sweep for their team. So guys, back at the studio, I just want to kind of give you an opportunity to weigh in here and see what questions you may have.
Yeah, Chris, great recap there, and I think it's important, really, as the judge pointed out, to thank this jury, because anyone who's ever been on jury duty knows what it entails. And most of the cases I've been on one, not half as complicated as this. Usually it's a one-sheet jury instruction, and you're there for a day. These folks, as we know, have been there for 6 weeks, and this was very complicated. Chris, I did want to ask you and Irv, you touched on it there, the testimony of Danny Solis, and I think just sort of the vision of an undercover hidden camera sort of gives the perception that there's something going on there that you're on the inside of. And I think the perhaps 2 quotes that really hurt Burke the most were, did we land the tuna? And has the cash register rung yet? Your opinion, Irv, I guess, just on the importance of that Solis testimony and how he was used in this trial, not only by the prosecutors by wearing the wire, but also by the defense on the stand.
You know, the last thing a prosecutor wants is to put on a witness that's dirty, and he was dirty in a legal sense, because then his credibility is at issue. When you have him recording the conversations and it's on tape, his credibility isn't an issue. It's the tape recordings that are the case. And that's what the government typically does in this building. And that's why the conviction rate in this building, frankly, is so high, because they take the time to do it right. They wire them up, they do video, so there's no issue. Now, Solis, he's going to be used by the government in the future. He got a sweetheart deal to cooperate with the government. Can you imagine the hours that FBI agents put in this case, listening to those recordings, listening to those conversations while they were actually occurring? So this was a big case for the government. They invested a lot in it, and obviously it's paid off up to this point.
Irv, I want to build on a question that Joe just asked there about another thing that may resonate with jurors and the public at large is the use of ruses, where the federal government is able to tell Danny Solis, hey, go into Ed Burke's office, tell him a few untruths to try and stir the pot a little bit and get some information to learn what his motive is. And there was some real concern in this case case that jurors might view ruses, albeit them legal, as problematic.
Not only are they legal, they're common, they're instructed, the jury's instructed that they are permissible. You never want to put a snitch in a situation where he could be getting information from an innocent person and it be interpreted in a guilty manner, if you could understand what they're saying. So the FBI is very careful on the ruses that they use. So they're only getting somebody who's culpable and not some innocent guy out there that could blurt out something that could end up in a penitentiary.
But that's the kind of thing, right, and I'd like you to weigh in if this is right or wrong, that how the jury in this case interpreted the use of ruses, the use of the undercover tape, could be beneficial to prosecutors in that Mike Madigan case.
Very beneficial. Obviously, he's now a proven, reliable source in the eyes of a jury, even though his credibility wasn't an issue. But the tapes said it all. The tapes say everything in this particular case.
Okay. Irv, let's go back to the studio.
And Irv, I have a question for perhaps you both. And Irv, you've been in the law for many decades. You have covered lots of these public corruption cases. I think a number of people in our audience are wondering, how could a guy like Ed Burke, who was so powerful for so long and so, by everyone's count, so very smart, and certainly knew that he had to be careful in his utterances, either privately or publicly, how could this have happened to him?
He didn't think anybody was listening. Obviously he didn't learn from Blagojevich or George Ryan or all the other aldermen that have been convicted in this building and have been sent to the penitentiary. He thought as long as he was talking to a friend and not the FBI listening, that he'd get away with whatever he thought he could, what he used the words legally get away with, which was obviously illegal.
Do you think it was arrogance over time?
Guys, I want to point out, sorry, Jim, go ahead.
No, I was going to ask you, do you think it was arrogance over time? This was just the way business was done with his law firm and with his time as chairman of the finance committee, that he just got sloppy?
When you use the word, this is the way business was done, frankly, Gary Chico's testimony was important to me just watching this. And it seemed like it was put in for a reason, and that is to show that this was not atypical of what was going on in the city of Chicago.
Let's explain to viewers what that conversation was. That was Ed Burke on a secret recording with former mayoral candidate and a political figure in his own right, Gary Chico, where Burke said, hey, this company that we're trying to get some donation money from isn't really doing what we're asking them to do. Maybe we need to check on their driveway permits. And what that did, I think from the prosecution standpoint, and as you just underlined, indicates that Burke treated this as sort of his mechanism, his ticket to ride that may or may not be limited to just these four schemes.
I guarantee you that the FBI agent that was listening to that conversation put a big red flag on it so they could show it to the U.S. Attorney's Office and say, hey, I think this may help you in your theory of the case.
Irv, I've had a quick follow-up as well. Several of the legal sources I spoke with going into this verdict talked about the repetitive nature of many of these counts and many of these charges. I'm hoping you can maybe explain to us how they got the jury to this guilty verdict on each count, because it was important for them to reach agreement on these so-called predicate charges, right? So this was not just the single charge. They had a lot more to consider. Maybe you can explain how those predicate charges worked.
So if you look at count one, which is the RICO count, you have to look at it as the umbrella. And everything, all the charges were incorporated with respect to Burke in that umbrella. And then they were broken down individually on all the subsequent counts 2, 3, 4, 5. But they needed to show at least two of those racketeering acts guilty beyond a reasonable doubt in order for the count one, the racketeering charge, to sustain a conviction, to be found guilty of that. So it's, frankly, you're right, there's a repetitive nature of this. Under the umbrella, together, and then separately as different counts alleged in the indictment.
Many of those also, legal analysts said that they, on the way in, figured he would probably get clipped on some of these. You touched on it a minute ago. Were you surprised that he was guilty on all but one?
I was not surprised because, Solis's testimony, the tapes from Solis were so powerful. And that's why, frankly, there's a reason that Burke couldn't take the stand in his own defense, and that is he wouldn't be able to explain the words that he used. What about the tuna? Did the cash register hasn't rung yet? There's no way for him to explain that. So that's why he couldn't take the stand. So am I surprised that it came in uncontradicted by the government and it led to a conviction? Absolutely not.
But this conversation speaks to, I think, the larger conversation that we've talked about, Irv, which is the raw tonnage of information that this jury has had to go through, not the least of which are the 300 plus pages of jury instructions. We talked off camera yesterday. Juries, time and again, prove they take this stuff very seriously. Sometimes outsiders look at the legal system with a jaded eye, but I know you have said that despite it being so complex, this jury's doing what most juries do, and they are taking it very seriously.
You know, a lot of people say that when a jury is out this long, that means they're fighting back there. I don't think that's the case with this particular jury. I think they were going through each count, going through how each count applied to each defendant, and the fact that they made a split decision on several of these says that they were really using their brains and trying to come up with an appropriate conclusion. Jurors sometimes, you know, get along great. There's one jury in Cook County from 30 years ago. They get together every year as an annual event. They stay in touch with one another. It's my experience that jurors typically take this seriously. They're going to call themselves the Ed Burke jury from now on, and that's how they'll be known, actually.
And Joe Duffy, in his closing, said to this group of 12 people, this very well may be the most important thing you do in your life. Now, he was trying to set the table and amplify the dramatics perhaps in his client's favor, but nonetheless, to your point, these are those moments in time for these individuals. I just want to set the table here again for what I'm seeing behind our camera. There is a bank of microphones. We are waiting to find out whether or not we're going to hear from any of the defendants here, obviously Pete Andrews or Ed Burke, any of their attorneys, the U.S. Attorney's Office, or any of the jurors who are all still upstairs. The jurors are in with the judge, we are understanding. She's thanking them for their dedicated service, Joe, and so these are the moving parts that we're waiting for here in the next hour or so.
Right. Chris, as we wait for that, can you lay a little more of the foundation for us as far as the other two defendants in Peter Andrews and Charles Cui, their connection to this case? Obviously, Burke was the headline. Their connection and why, in the end, Andrews was found not guilty on everything and Cui basically was guilty on everything.
Yeah, so great point. We're sometimes in the weeds where we need to zoom out, and Ed Burke is touching all four of these so-called episodes. What's happening is that Ed Burke was touching all four of the episodes. Pete Andrews was only involved in the Burger King scheme. That, of course, is the scheme where Ed Burke, now we can say by a jury's ruling, tried to extort a billionaire Texas-based Burger King franchisee to say, hey, listen, I will help you with your permitting if you hire Clafter & Burke tax law firm to do your business. That was the machine by which Burke kind of orchestrated payment. So Pete Andrews was only involved in that part of it. Pete Andrews was limited exclusively to the Burger King scheme. And what the jury found, and there were a lot of pieces and parts to the closing from Pete Andrews' team, but I think what was most salient to those of us who sat through this every day was that the FBI came to Pete Andrews' home at the same moment that Ed Burke's offices were being raided, both at City Hall and in the 14th Ward. They went to Pete Andrews and they asked him questions. And the questions they asked him, the order in which they were delivered, the way they presented it, the pictures they showed him of those Burger King franchisees created enough doubt in these jurors' minds to say, you know what, Pete Andrews, he was told that their name was Dehani and it was Dehani. He showed them pictures, the FBI showed him pictures of two gentlemen who don't look like the same person he met 17 months prior for 27 minutes. So what the jury, Joe, I think came back with was saying, hey, you know what, I think the FBI may have tried to be a little too cute in trying to get Pete Andrews to kind of fall into their trap. Lastly here on Charles Cui, he was only limited to the fourth of these four schemes, and that is the Binny's Pole sign up in Portage Park. He, of course, the developer of that mall who was trying to use Burke's influence to get his needs met, and Burke again asking, and got in that case, a contract signed with Charles Cui to work with Clafter & Burke, Burke's tax law firm.
All right, we're going to ask you and Irv to stand by, and we want to show you just quickly, in case you are just joining us, a graphic of all of the verdicts that did come down just a short time ago against Ed Burke and also Peter Andrews and Charles Cui. We will show our viewers those counts. It's coming right now. And as we do show these counts, we want to head over to now 32nd Ward Alderman Scott Wagaspack, who joins us now via Zoom. Alderman, can you hear me? There he is. Alderman, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
All right, let's get your reaction first to the verdicts just read.
Well, I think this is a long time coming. A lot of us, knew that there were ethical issues in the Committee on Finance that Ed Burke was running for many years. When I became the finance chairman, I think after he had reigned over it for several decades, we really wanted to change the set of rules and the way that we operated and really change the way that he had been doing business. So for a lot of us, I think this was something that we knew was wrong, and eventually it was going to catch up with him. And of course, with the counts today and the conviction, we're at that point.
This for people watching this and saying this is just another black eye for Chicago politics, and it's sort of how the business and the city is run. You're saying what, that it's no longer that way, or are people watching this case saying, see, this is still happening?
No, I think it can still happen. And, we have to continue not only in the city council, but across this state to set up ethics barriers that prevent elected officials who come into office or have been in an office for a long time from continuing to, commit this kind of public corruption. And we still continue to see quid pro quos in the way business is done. And I think a lot of us want to make sure that, as we go through this process, as we become elected officials, that we set up those barriers. I think when Mayor Lightfoot, when she was first elected to office, she upset a lot of aldermen by saying, hey, we've got to change the way we're doing business here. And removing Ed Burke from that position, making sure that he wasn't put back into it was a good step. But we need accountability across the board so that it just doesn't continue. But even with that, if you look back just over the last few years, the people I've served with, there's been at least half a dozen who've gone to prison for similar activities. Now, on this one, with taxpayers losing out on what I think is billions of dollars in taxes, when you look at what's happened with Madigan, when you look at what happened with Burke, and this goes back decades, it is really the taxpayers and the citizens who've been losing out.
Well, I know you're not as connected with Mike Madigan, at least on a state level, as you were with Ed Burke. But if you were to read the tea leaves, what does this mean for Mike Madigan?
Well, I think it sends a message to any would-be jurors there and to the different teams on the defense and the plaintiff side prosecution side, that he's in pretty serious trouble. I think people are starting to look at this public corruption with more of an eye toward putting an end to the old machine politics, and I think that's the right direction to go. I wasn't surprised that the jurors deliberated for that long, because this was very complex. And I think, as your experts were testifying here, it's not easy to get people who know that they have to watch out when they're speaking to people. But in this case, Ed Burke felt he was protected because he had an old friend who was delving into the same public corruption troughs as he was.
What does a verdict like this do through City Hall and the halls of City Hall, if you will, Alderman? Even if you were to maybe perhaps consider something like this, Ed Burke's coming out of the courtroom right now. We're getting a visual of that. In other words, I guess, if this were something that were still a thought among some in City Council, does this persuade them not to do it?
A lot of people looked up to Ed Burke in the city council over the many decades, and I think this should send a reverberating message that this is the last person you want to look up to. It's not the kind of thing that people should be doing. If people are thinking about committing public corruption or acts of public corruption, they better think twice, because I think the public integrity unit of the U.S. Attorney has really proven here that no matter how great you think you are, how tall you stand in any elected body, they can bring you down.
Alderman, let's hold on for a second and see if the cameras are close enough to get a comment from Ed Burke. You got it in? Okay. Okay. Absolutely. Okay, yeah, we're not going to be able to hear anything. So, Alderman, I guess to circle back to that point, I guess, quid pro quo is one thing. You scratch my back, I'll scratch yours. That's another thing, is it not? I mean, isn't that kind of how politics work?
Well, I think, when you're looking to make changes in the city council and ordinances and things like that, there might be ways to go about it that are perfectly legal. I can support this ordinance if you support this ordinance, and people do that all the time. Mm-hmm. I think what happened here is, over the decades, Ed Burke and a lot of other aldermen made this personal profit over public integrity. And when people started doing that, they get exposed. That lack of accountability eventually comes out, and they're held accountable. And I think this case, it probably took a lot longer than people expected. A lot of us knew that some of this activity was going on, not to that same extent, but that Danny Solis got him on both the camera and the audio for. But, a lot of us were pushing back on some of his tax appeal issues many years ago, and trying to convince our colleagues, more than 26 out of the 50, to act against it was often a very difficult task. I think over the years we were building up on that. We were able to push back on some of these issues and expose it more. But it also required mayors who would stand up and say enough is enough. And I think the detente that Mayor Daley showed, the detente that Rahm Emanuel showed, was very telling. It was basically, you know what, Ed, we're going to be hands off of you if you sort of stay hands off of what we're doing. And I think that allowed him to flourish in the position he was in. Unfortunately, it was to the total detriment of taxpayers.
Alderman, before we let you go, quickly, you're writing the headline tomorrow. What does it say?
Longest serving alderman finally goes down. I think this is something that is very surprising for a lot of people, but as you were saying before, alluding to, it should send a strong message to elected officials across the state that whatever they are doing that's illegal needs to stop.
All right. Alderman Scott Waguespack, thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it. Let's bring Chris Tye back in. And Chris, I think it is, as you said, worthwhile to zoom out just for a second. As I was listening to the alderman, I remembered when this all went down. I mean, everyone thought, okay, wow, this is really a big deal involving Ed Burke. And then all of a sudden you're like, wait a minute, they got another alderman to wear a wire? I mean, this is just almost, it's, I guess in a way it's Chicago politics, and as even the alderman said, maybe many are not surprised, but in some ways this was really a wow moment.
It was a wow moment, Joe, and I think they even used that term during this trial, that there have been wow moments throughout. And in fact, that whole way of doing business in Chicago, the Chicago way, was really something that Burke's team in particular tried to mute, to try to put the brakes on the overuse of that, because I think the concern was if the jury was marinating in that kind of thinking, it would be easier for the wheels to get greased to get to a guilty verdict. Now, in the end, they threw almost the entire book at Burke, so who knows if that was resonant with those jurors. But yes, I think the whole mechanism of Chicago politics, warts and all, was exposed in a way that we have not seen before. Certainly, now we can say, just within the last half hour, the outcome of this case is historic. We have never seen somebody with this kind of resume in Chicago found guilty, but this statistic that Dick Simpson, the former alderman and UIC professor, put to me before this trial began jumped out. Since 1969, 37 members of Chicago City Council have been convicted of a crime. Since 1969, Ed Burke now marks the 38th, Joe.
Chris, can you give us a better picture of what happened on the way out there when Ed Burke left, where he was in relation to the podium, and does that mean his attorneys are not going to be making a statement?
Great question. So he came down an elevator bank. He usually comes out of the elevators down here on the south side of Dirksen. He instead came out on the north side with, as you saw on video a moment ago, with his attorneys and his family in tow. His attorneys left the building. It appears as though we will not be hearing from Ed Burke's legal team today or from the former alderman himself. Again, some of the outstanding characters that we still might hear from today would be the U.S. attorney, members of the prosecution team, the jurors, or attorneys for Pete Andrews and Charles Cui.
Chris, what was the takeaway from legal experts and analysts who watched this closely, in particular when it came to the closing arguments? Because I know the prosecution took hours and hours, and at some point it seemed like maybe even the defense said, listen, we need to cut through some of this and give you the bottom line of this. This really went on a long time when it came to the closings.
Yeah, in the end, the prosecution presented about a 5-hour closing, and then they had a rebuttal at the end that was another 90 minutes or so. So 6.5, 7 hours of closings just for one side of the courtroom. Then you had 3 other sets of lawyers producing their own closing statements. So there was, as we were talking with Irv, the raw tonnage of just stuff that these people had to hear and process. And that's before hearing those 300-plus pages of jury instructions. So what was asked of these jurors, what they consumed there really throughout the last 6 weeks, but particularly in those closings, as you underlined, Joe, really do point to their ability to withstand pain, to devote time, to devote concentration and focus. And to your point also, the defense teams did try to sort of poke a little fun at the prosecution by saying, hey, listen, I'm not going to take as long as she did. Diane MacArthur is the prosecutor, the chief prosecutor. She went on very, very long, and they said, we're not going to do that, hoping to earn a little, maybe brownie points with the jury. It's
also telling, Chris, I think, that the jury, as impressive as they were going through all of this, only asked, as I understand it, 3 questions. Is that right? And one of them was to request another copy of the jury instructions, all 300 and something pages of it.
Yes. I'm going to be very honest with you, Joe. If there wasn't a verdict today, I don't know what I would have put on the news tonight to even tell you, because they were so quiet. They did. Yesterday was complete radio silence. Today, up until the 2 o'clock hour, complete radio silence. They did have those 2 questions 2 days ago, asking one about Ed Burke's dual employment. Is it okay for him to both be a private tax attorney and a public city councilman? And then there was a question about Amtrak employees. And Amtrak fits into this very complex puzzle because Amtrak train lines run underneath the post office, which is one of the 4 schemes.
Chris, it's Jim Williams here. I have a question for you. Ed Burke had a number of supporters who showed up at court to provide some moral support. We saw Chris Kennedy, the son of the late Senator Robert Kennedy, one day. Were any of those folks in court today? And did you hear any sounds from anybody when the verdicts were read?
No, Jim, the room was completely and utterly silent. Ed Burke, right before things began, had his hands on the table, palms down, and then as the jury verdict was read by the judge, not the foreperson of note, he kind of put his hands below his chin and kind of absorbed it that way. The only notable faces in that crowd today, we had heard from, as you mentioned, Mr. Kennedy, who was here last week. We had heard from a couple of other aldermen, past aldermen, who were in the crowd to show their support for Burke over this 6-week trial. But no, today it was pretty much the people who worked on this case for the feds, and there was probably 12.5 of them, the people who weren't the frontline attorneys, and then the Burke family, of course, a whole lot of media and U.S. Marshals. That was pretty much the bulk of the back of the courtroom today.
All right, thank you, Chris. We want to add to our coverage today by inviting in former Alderman Roderick Sawyer, who just established a political consulting firm, to the conversation. Thank you for being with us, and what is your reaction to this verdict?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me this afternoon. The jury has spoken, and as a lawyer, I respect the outcome of the jury. They made a decision that Burke was guilty, and he has to live with that and abide by that. I am personally, upset that they came out that way, but again, I respect the jury's verdict and I respect the outcome. I'm sure there are going to be appeals and other post-trial motions that will be going forward that will extend this months on end. But again, the jury has spoken.
You said you're personally upset. I wonder if you could explain why.
Well, on a larger scale, it does put a black eye towards alders in the city of Chicago. I heard the prior statement of 38 now alders that have been convicted for various crimes. And that is what I was saying that I'm upset about. It's just the perception that aldermen, although we work very hard, they work very hard. They work 8 days a week, although it's considered a part-time position. But the vast majority of the alders that are there work every day to make sure their communities are getting what's necessary, what's deserved of them. And for this to occur, it does set a black eye on the entirety of the profession or the elected position.
Yeah.
We were curious, though, does this translate now into a new chapter for the current city alderman? Or is this how things were done in previous years?
I was talking to someone yesterday and talking about the length of time that Alderman Burke had sat on the city council. He was there for most of his adulthood. He got there in his 20s and stayed 50 plus years. So he was engaged and in tune to a different type of political activity that was more popular in the days gone by 50 plus years ago. That is not acceptable now.
All right.
Here in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Yeah, former Alderman Roderick Sawyer, now a political consultant, thank you for joining us. We have to cut away to talk to the lawyers now. Thanks so much.
Yeah, we do expect to hear from the U.S. attorneys coming to the podium. You're watching these live pictures from the Dirksen Federal Building, where cameras are ready and waiting to hear from these attorneys. We expect to hear them react to the verdict today, read just about an hour ago.
Here we go.
At this point, let's listen in.
Good afternoon. My name is Morris Pasquale. I'm the acting United States Attorney for the Northern District of Illinois here in Chicago. I'd like to start first by thanking the members of the jury in this case who answered their call to service and served conscientiously over the many weeks of this trial. This case was about bribery and extortion occurring at the highest levels of Chicago city government. Our office represents the people of the United States. The people have a right to honest and open government where decisions about official actions that public officials take or do not take are based not on their own private financial interest, but on the public interest. That did not happen in this case. In this case, defendant Burke had his hand out for money. He tied the giving of official action by him to the giving of money to him in 3 separate corrupt episodes. And in the Field Museum episode, he attempted to extort money from the Field Museum for the benefit of a family member of a close friend of his. The public voted Mr. Burke into office, and they trusted that he would be guided by and motivated by pursuing the common good. He betrayed that trust. We are gratified that the jury saw this case for what it was and that they held Mr. Burke accountable for his corrupt conduct. Here with me, standing behind me, are the 4 prosecutors who tried the case: Sarah Stryker, Diane MacArthur, Timothy Chapman, and Shushma Raju, together with Amar Bachu, who's the head of our public corruption and organized crime section. In addition to thanking them, of course, my thanks go out to the FBI, the City of Chicago Inspector General's Office, and the Amtrak Inspector General for their hard work and dedication that led up to the successful resolution of this case. Our office remains resolute and determined to root out public corruption occurring at any and all levels of government and to bring those who commit public corruption offenses to justice. At this time, I'm going to turn the microphone over to FBI Special Agent in Charge, Robert Wheeler, who has some remarks, and then I'm going to come back and I can entertain a few questions at that time.
Thank you. I would just say briefly, public corruption matters are extremely important to the FBI. They're a major priority for FBI Chicago. We will continue to work these matters as we've done for a long time, and we'll continue to do it. For this case, I'm just very grateful to the FBI Chicago agents, the analysts and staff that brought it and worked so well with the prosecutors here in the Northern District. It's a real testament to the quality of work that takes place here. Can't thank them enough, and also some of the partners that we had along the way. City of Chicago Office of Inspector General for Amtrak, and just a magnificent partnership with the Northern District here. Thank you.
Okay, questions?
What's this say for the corruption that just continues to come out of City Hall and city government here, and historically, why this city has such a bad rap?
That's a $64,000 question. So Alderman Burke obviously joins a long list of corrupt city council aldermen who have been convicted of corruption charges over here in federal court. All I can say is what I said before, that we're determined to continue to investigate these cases using any and all lawful tools at our disposal to ferret out that corruption.
Do you think this is going to send a message that is going to change any behavior going forward?
Well, we have not had the sentencing yet. Obviously, Alderman Burke was a very powerful alderman. This case has had massive publicity, and I like to think that public officials out there who are tempted to start down this path will be either further on notice that, you know, the federal government is out there, the FBI is out there, the U.S. Attorney's Office is out there, and we're aggressively pursuing these type of matters.
Ed Burke was an alderman for 50 years before your office brought charges against him. What took it so long? Because this clearly established a pattern of behavior by Ed Burke, and I think it would be reasonable for someone to look at the evidence presented to the jury and say, this was not the first crime that the alderman committed. Why was he allowed to operate to amass the kind of power that he used to extort the victims in this case?
Well, in the United States, ma'am, the trials are conducted based on evidence.
Why did it take so long for that evidence?
Trials are conducted based on evidence. It is the responsibility of our office, together with federal law enforcement, to accumulate, assemble that evidence, present it to a point where we're satisfied it meets the standards of beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the process. The speculation about other things that went on and why it couldn't be done sooner, that's all a function of what evidence is available to us in a particular investigation.
Mr. Pascal, are you disappointed in the exoneration of Pete Andrews?
We respect the verdict of the jury in all its respects. Obviously, the jury was instructed to treat each defendant separately, to give separate consideration to each defendant, and they diligently discharged that responsibility and followed those instructions, and they reached the verdict. So I'm not going to say, I'm going to say I respect the verdict of the jury.
Do you have any sense of what kind of prison time Ed Burke could face on this? I know there's the general guidelines, but
I don't. You're aware of the statutory maximum time, but I don't have anything more precise that I can share.
The maximum, sir?
Our sentencing decisions will be made, recommendations will be made after the completion of the pre-sentence investigation report, after we've had a chance to weigh all the aggravating and mitigating evidence, and then we'll formulate and submit our sentencing recommendations.
Just a couple more questions.
Is the investigation still going?
Our public corruption investigations are always still going. We're always not eagerly, have our ears open for members of the public who feel like their public officials have not lived up to their responsibility to conduct honest government. And so we're always open for business, and we're always all ears for those matters.
What should Mike Madigan read into this
of the prosecution's offer of Danny Solis's non-prosecution agreement, do you think that what Danny Solis did helped convict Ed Burke, and does it merit him not spending a single day in jail for also serving as a corrupt alderperson?
Well, there were extensive jury arguments in this case, and I'll just boil it down to one proposition, that we feel like we presented the best evidence going to show Alderman Burke's knowledge and intent, the words out of his own mouth, and we don't regret that trial strategy one bit.
What should Mike Madigan read into this verdict?
So Madigan is a pending case, so I can't comment on that. Okay, fellas, I'm going to have to wrap, ladies and gentlemen, I'll need to wrap it up. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
You've been listening to Morris Pasquale, the acting U.S. attorney, sort of summing up the verdicts today, saying this was about bribery and extortion at the highest level of Chicago politics. He said Ed Burke ultimately had his hand out for money, and added that the public expects politicians to pursue the common good. He, Burke, betrayed that trust. I believe we still have Irv with us, do we not? Okay, Irv, a lot of questions for you on this. Let's start with one of the questions that I think, or one of the points I wanted to make out here, is that when the feds come for you, they usually get their target. I think the federal success rate is somewhere around 90% or more, correct?
Oh, it's more than 90% on jury trials in this building, coupled with the numerous amount of pleas of guilty, because frankly, it's my experience in this building, when the FBI puts a case together, they do a good job, they confront the defendant with the evidence, and that's exactly what Solis was looking at. They grabbed him, they showed him some evidence, and in his best judgment, I think, he decided it was better to become a witness than to become a defendant in federal court.
Yeah, let me ask one more question, then we'll hand it over to Jim and Marie for some of theirs as well. But on that Solis topic, it was interesting. One of the reporters asked, why did this take so long? And you heard Pasquale say that, they had their ducks to get in a row, and they have to make sure they have this case beyond a reasonable doubt, which is one of the reasons why the federal success rate is where it is, as we just discussed. But the other interesting point of this, was it worth their while? Was it worth this deal they cut with Solis in order to get Burke? And as the reporter said, you've got one other dirty alderman who got away with nothing.
Well, when you compare the role of Solis in the city council versus the role of Ed Burke, frankly, there's no comparison. I've said that Ed Burke was more powerful in this community than Rod Blagojevich. Ed Burke had total control over the city council. He had total control out of what bills got paid. But not only that, he had influence within the Cook County Democratic Party. He's the one who had to endorse judicial candidates to put on the endorsed Democratic ballots. Tremendous power, both politically and in a legal sense, in his role in the city council. Nobody that I know of, and I've been in this city my entire life, matches the power that he had with respect to both of those propositions.
And at the same time, Irv, he had this private law firm, and he was seeking business from people, clients, potential clients, who had business before the city council.
There's an ethical issue there, but as the judge instructed the jury, there's nothing wrong with aldermen in the city of Chicago having outside employment, especially as lawyers representing clients. Perhaps that principle needs to be relooked at and revised based upon what has happened with not only him, but what Mr. Madigan is alleged to have done as in the General Assembly and also doing real estate tax work. So, this takes, hopefully people will learn the lesson from this case as to what you want our elected officials to do when they're not serving in their elected capacities.
Irv, I would also think it's pretty common, you heard the U.S. attorneys there saying that they respected the jury's decision on Peter Andrews and leaving it at that. Is this a situation where it seems silly to say they're taking what they can get, or they're taking the big dog here, which is Ed Burke. What is that perspective usually that these U.S. attorneys have when the result is something like that?
They will always make that same comment, whether you're in state court or you're in any federal court in this country. The prosecutor will never, ever criticize a jury or a jury's verdict, despite what they may personally believe. They will always say they respect the judgment of the jury, and frankly, that's the right answer in that case.
Irv, there was a question asked about prison time, and Morris Pasquale was not willing to go there, understandably. This is something that I guess ultimately is out of his control, but I guess he could ask for the maximum, which was also asked of him, and he didn't go near that. You think Ed Burke could face 8 to 12 years just on count 1?
Well, actually, he was found guilty on 3 counts that carry a 20-year maximum.
Each one?
It's my belief that no, they will not be consecutive. It would be concurrent. But it just shows that there were 3 main counts, powerful counts, that carry a 20-year maximum sentence. They're so serious under federal law. I totally believe that the U.S. Attorney's Office will be making a sentencing recommendation, but that will be first in writing in their response to the pre-sentence investigation, but it'll also be verbally before Judge Kendall at the sentencing hearing, as well as his attorneys will make sentencing recommendations based on the fact that their client he's about to turn 80 years old, may have health issues, it's not a crime of violence, but the U.S. attorneys can say, hey, this is public corruption, and that's serious stuff.
Where do you think that number comes in, Irv?
I think when you consider the federal sentencing guidelines and the probation department will compute what those numbers are, it's going to be anywhere from 1 to 20. I suspect it'll be somewhere in the middle, and that's why I think the range of 8 to 12 is about where my guess is this judge will end up imposing. He would have to do 85% of whatever number that she sets, and typically at sentencing, that is when a person typically goes into custody with a report date to the Bureau of Prisons sometime after that. The only issue after that, Joe, is whether or not the appellate court here, the 7th Circuit, will allow him to stay out on bond pending the appeal.
The other issue Morris Pasquale not willing to touch is Mike Madigan, because it's a pending matter. You don't have those same restrictions, Irv. What's the message today to Mike Madigan?
Well, he is, I'm sure, he and his attorneys have been keeping track of every word that was said in that courtroom, what every witness testified to. I suspect that his attorneys may want to interview the jurors in this case to try to find out what their thoughts are, as what evidence they thought was compelling and what evidence was not very compelling. It is a different case. There are similarities and dissimilarities, but the main part of what is in common between the 2 cases is former Alderman Solis. It's those tape recordings, some of the same recordings, but many different, because Madigan was a totally separate set of recordings that are going to be played in his trial. So while the 2 are somewhat linked, but there's also some discrepancy and distinctions between the 2 cases.
All right. Irv, we're going to ask you to stand by. We appreciate, as always, your legal insight. We'll be back with you in just a minute, but we do want to reset for those folks who are just joining us right now and let you know that Ed Burke has been found guilty today on 13 of the 14 charges that he was facing in this case, and let's run them down for you right now. Count 1, racketeering, guilty. Count 2, federal program bribery, guilty. Count 3, use of an interstate facility to promote bribery and official misconduct. That was also guilty. Use of interstate facility to promote bribery and official misconduct. Count 4, guilty. So what you're seeing on the left there are the number of counts ultimately that he was convicted on, 7 of them involving bribery, 1 count of racketeering. That was the big one that Irv Miller just mentioned a minute ago. The only not guilty verdict for Ed Burke was count 6, which had to do with the Burger King scheme, and that was conspiracy to commit extortion, because he was found guilty on count 5, which was attempted extortion, not guilty on conspiracy to commit extortion. That just gives you an idea, though, of just how complicated these charges and the implications and all of the information that this jury had to sift through. Let's check back in once again with Chris Tye, who has been covering this trial start to finish. Chris?
You know, Joe, as you went through all of those convictions, all those charges and the guilty verdicts that came back, I couldn't help but think how long it has taken for us to get here. Not just the 6+ week trial, not even just the 5+ years since the raids occurred. Both of the gentlemen that you heard speak at the podium in the last 20 minutes did not hold that office when this investigation began. This is one of those moments in time, and there is Ed Burke about 20 minutes ago leaving Dirksen Federal Building with his family and attorneys in tow. This is a trial that has taken a very long time. It has lasted through several administrations, both at the FBI and at the U.S. Attorney's Office. And, you know, a lot of talk was, a lot of focus was spent on the batting average of the U.S. Attorney's Office. You know, what do they come in at? They always hear, if the feds come after you, they got you. Well, think about this. In the big cases in this building this year alone, they have almost, now we're talking about the marquee cases here. In the ComEd case, the feds got guilty verdicts on every count. They also got Tim Mapes guilty on every count. This was a big win for the U.S. Attorney's Office today, but that Pete Andrews not guilty is an outlier in the U.S. Attorney Office batting average, and that one by Ed Burke perhaps less so. But I think that kind of gives us some context of, you know, how these U.S. attorneys often leave this building feeling bulletproof.
Chris, I wanted to ask, we saw that video of Ed Burke leaving again, and he seemed to have the same, I'm calling it a neutral face, no reaction that we've seen every morning when he's walked into court. And it sounds like that was his reaction today as they read these guilty verdicts. Can you talk about what emotion, if any, you saw from Burke during these 6+ weeks in the trial? And also, I know you mentioned his wife gave him a hug as these verdicts were being read, but can you give us a sense of the temperature of any emotion in that courtroom?
You know, that neutral is exactly the right way to frame this, Marie. He had a poker face this whole way through, and maybe it's just a byproduct of 50+ years in public office and being largely Teflon throughout all of that, until today, of course. And he really kept his calm the whole way through. There was never really a blip. When he would see friends in the audience, he'd give them a warm embrace. When he'd see his kids and his wife, of course, it would be very warm and friendly. There'd be long breaks during this trial, and they would meet out in the hallway and chit-chat and move down to a different floor to kind of get out of the media's purview. But on the whole, I would say he was, as you saw him in that video moments ago, cool, calm, and collected.
Chris, quick follow-up on the Burke side of things. Was there any surprise at all that their defense was as, I guess, brief as it was? Were some watching this trial expecting more?
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have 4.5 weeks, give or take, of the prosecution laying out witness after witness. Now, remember, there was 5 days off because of COVID. There was Thanksgiving. There was another holiday in there. But, yeah, they really probably put on, I mean, the defense team put on Danny Solis, and that was essentially it. The prosecution put on 35 witnesses. So, yeah, it did seem a little lopsided, but certainly in the end, it wasn't enough. That Danny Solis effort was not enough to protect their client today.
Chris, we are going to let you reset for our news coming up at 4 o'clock. Jim, Marie, we will join you then. And in the meantime, just a quick recap. An historic afternoon at the Dirksen Federal Building. Former longtime alderman Ed Burke found guilty on all but one charge in his corruption and racketeering case. Back with the latest and much more coming up on the CBS 2 News at 4 o'clock.
This has been breaking news from CBS 2.
We've got a good